So welcome to everybody who's here. It's really exciting to get to this point, and we're really excited to even maybe next year get to host this workshop in person, this training in person, and never be in Zoom ever again. So all of these recordings are going to be up on our website, and I'll be sending them out after the event so that folks can review anything that they've missed. We're going to go a little fast today, so I apologize about that. So please do put your questions into the chat box, and we'll have a short Q&A in the middle of today's workshop. So next slide, Brian. I think I have my overview. All right, so we're going to go through an introduction and just a basic, aquatic invasive species 101 until about 9:15. And then Brian's going to deliver, the meat and potatoes of today's talk. So going into species identification of all of the target aquatic invasive species that we here in the Adirondacks are looking for as an early detection program. So he's going to first discuss plants, then animals, trying to break it up, and then a quick Q&A because there are so many species we're going to review. So please do, think about questions there, and we'll be able to answer any of your questions following this workshop via email or even phone call. So don't worry too much if we're going quickly, and there's a lot of resources I'll connect you to afterwards that we already have recorded, or things that you'll be able to look at and see and use time and time again in terms of, say, a field guide. Then we're going to just do a quick prevention and detection review of best practices to prevent the spread and introduction of aquatic invasive species. And then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A at the end. Brian and I tried to pack a lot in today, but since we do have that break, that 10 to 10:30 break, we're able to stay online with folks and answer a lot more questions, though we want you to be able to have a break as well. So maybe by 10:15, we'll take a solid break and come back at 10:30 for the second part of the workshop. So a lot of questions, use the chat and we'll field all of those. Next slide, please, Brian. So as I said, I keep saying Brian and Emily. Who are Brian and Emily? My name is Emily Beldinan. If you haven't met me or emailed me yet, it's so nice to meet you, and it's so nice to have you here in this volunteer training. I am the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Programs Education Outreach Coordinator. My email is here, and if you're in this workshop, you've likely already gotten emails from me, but we'll be continuously giving you all of our contact info because we're here to answer questions, to troubleshoot challenges. As you can see, we face challenges ourselves with technology, but we're here to help and navigate the process together. And then we also have on the line and teaching you all today is Brian Green, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Programs, somewhat new, but not that new anymore, Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator. Brian joins us from the state of Pennsylvania, and now he's in New York, and we're so happy to have him. And so if you've worked with APIPP in the past, this is a long time program. He's the new Aaron, so you can always reach out to Brian as the new Aaron. We can't replace Aaron. Aaron might even be on the call right now. I'm not sure. So please welcome Brian, and he's going to be able to help you throughout this entire process, help you adopt a leak, help you get out on the water, help you understand what invasive species are what, and help you navigate this data collection process, because we've worked to try to, evolve a couple of things. So we're excited to reveal that. Next slide, please, Brian. So in the chat, I would love for you to just, start using the chat, but let us know who you are, where are you? And we asked this in the RSVP process, but what lake are you thinking to survey? I would just love to get to know some of you here today, and it helps us understand, who's on the call. This is a lake I love. This is 7th Lake. Hi, Lee. Hi, Lee Warren. Next slide, please. Oh, wow, San Antonio. Next, or you can hit next. So just some objectives today. I already reviewed this, but we're going to discuss what the impacts of aquatic invasive species are, and then understand for this first part, our objectives are to understand the identifying features of a number of different target invasive plants and animals, and then understand some best management practices and spread prevention. Just a quick review. Next slide, please. a lot of folks here are familiar with what the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program is, or APIPP. We're close to over 20-year program of the Nature Conservancy in the Adirondacks, and we're co-managed by the Department of Environmental Conservation and funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, which also funds 8 different partners for regional invasive species management, or PRISMs, across New York State. So if you're also, zooming in from a different part of New York State, and say you're a regional resident or love to visit the Adirondacks and want to, survey a lake while you're up here and volunteer with us, we can also connect you to all these other resources and organizations working to prevent the spread and manage the negative impacts of invasive species statewide. So next slide, please. Wow, there's so many, thank you so much for, it's so fun to hear where everybody's at. So just to clarify some terms, there's a lot out there, a lot of different terminology in order to talk about invasive plants, invasive animals, and I just want to get us all on the same page before we move forward. When I talk about invasive, that word invasive, there's very specific criteria that goes into it. Not every plant, not every animal that hasn't evolved in a geography and moves or is introduced or is planted or is growing is necessarily invasive. When we talk about invasive, that means that it is causing an observed harm, either ecologically, economically, right? If it's impacting farms, forests, fisheries, or even, built infrastructure, or it's causing a severe harm socially. So this might be removing cultural impacts from the landscape, right? If we love fishing and there's no more fish, but it can also be, human health challenges. There are non-native species that are introduced and they might not necessarily cause this ecological, economic, or social harm. And then there's nuisance species, right? Common weeds that might, be annoying in our garden, but they don't cause that ecological, economic, or social harm, that severe harm. And so when we talk about invasive species, we're talking, the other term for it out west might be noxious species. And so that has that observed harm. Biogeographical context matters, right? We might have species that are from North America that we're looking at today, like rusty crayfish is a great example. It's not even from that far across the globe. They're from Ohio, but they cause severe harm. You might have species that come all the way from California, like rainbow trout or Oregon, but they do not have that severe harm. So biogeographic context matters, and there's a lot of different gray areas. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So why are some non-native species invasive? Well, when they've moved into this new geography, they're moving on their own. They're moving without all of the other species in an ecosystem that they've evolved with over time that might limit their growth, limit population control, limit their spread, or limit, say soil chemistry even, or water chemistry. So when that species is moved to a new area or introduced to a new area, it's lacking predators and parasites. It might produce millions and millions of seeds, like purple loosestrife, for example. We have a lot of invasive species in our area that are generalists, so they can handle any water temperature, any water chemistry, any soil chemistry, any light conditions, and that's not the same for a lot of native species. And because they can take advantage of all those resources, they can then monopolize resources and start to cause ecological and economic or social harm. So next slide, please. And I'm trying to zoom through this because we lost so much time, so I apologize. You can hit the next one. And so I'm not going to go, or because we're missing a photo, but I'm not going to go too much into the value of biodiversity. I can go on and on and on. I think a lot of the folks who are on this call already understand a lot of the importance of why biodiversity in our landscape matters. It builds resiliency. It is the diversity of the food web. And so I'm just going to talk about the loss of ecosystem services when we have a huge amount of invasive species problems causing harm ecologically, right? So we're losing a lot of biodiversity from that competition that I just talked about. We may not have species any longer on the landscape that that have enough space to grow, that have enough nutrients to grow, that have enough, you know, food for themselves to grow. Talking about food, we have a lot of food web disruption. Brian's going to talk about spiny waterfleas and fishhook waterfleas in a little bit, and that's, you know, looking at the very bottom of the food web, those primary producers and zooplankton. If any part of, you know, the food web is interrupted with an invasive species moving in and dominating resources, we're going to lose very specific food for other very specific native species. Often people talk about pollinators. Pollinators have often evolved with one specific plant over the eons. And so if we're losing that plant, that pollinator is losing their food. So a lot of people forget that native aquatic plants are also really important pollinator plants too. We may have decreased light and oxygen and space. So this top photo, I think it's a milfoil. It could be a hydrilla though. You're having, when we say aquatic invasive plants can clog waterways, we literally mean clog waterways. And so it's darkening all the space below for native plants to be growing, or even for fish to be moving around. I'm going to talk a little bit also about how aquatic invasive species can warm waters. When we have this volume of plants clogging a waterway, we also are losing the flow and, you know, light conditions that previously existed in a waterway that might have kept it cold. When we have warmer waters, we lose oxygen in our water, and then we can see fish die-offs like you have here below. In terms of erosion control, or, you know, increasing or changing how stormwater runoff goes into our aquatic systems, we can also see a lot of eutrophication, which is an overloading of nutrients into an aquatic system that can also lead to a fish die-off like you see here. Next slide, please. And then there's massive economic impact. So I talk about fish a lot. I came to this position from a, you know, a productive industrial port, and got to know a lot of, you know, professional fishermen. And you lose so many jobs, so many, you know, even tourism, especially tourism in our area, when you start to lose native fish populations, or even introduce and hatchery fish populations, because the water quality is so incredibly dampened. You have impaired recreation, and as we all know, in the Adirondacks, recreation is also an economic engine in our area. So nobody wants to swim through this this below photo of all these creepy, dense plants. I certainly don't want to swim through it. And so we can really impact our tourism industry and recreation. But then you can also have massively reduced property values. So you've bought a lake house, and then suddenly you have this milfoil issue. Not only is your lake association, home association paying for that management, because it is costly, but it is very, very vital and important, but you could potentially lose value of the home you purchased. Human health impacts, cyanobacteria and dead zones, like I talked about with those fish die-offs. We had that issue come up in Lake George last year, and these are really serious issues that can seriously harm the health of children and kill pets. Let alone, you know, the massive amount of dead fish that can erupt. The Hudson River actually had quite a few dead zones and fish die-offs last summer because of the warmer ambient temperatures as well. And drinking water quality, there's nothing more important than clean water and fresh water. Next, please. And lastly, before I hand it over to Brian, just going back to the importance of fish and cold water and temperatures, reducing the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species in the Adirondacks is incredibly vital to also support the survival of cold water fish in a changing climate. So cold water fish are your trout, your lake trout, your salmon, and your smelt. Some of the most beloved fish in our area. I don't know if you love them. I love them. We all love them. And they need cold water in order to survive. And so it's already observed that these cold water fish in our warming temperatures, in our reduced precipitation, and our reduced snow melt, are finding a refuge, or a cold water refugia, as they say, throughout the hot summers, increasingly hot summers, by going deeper and deeper into lakes where it's colder, where they can find pockets of oxygen that they would have not been able to find in warmer water, and their metabolism is optimal. So they need that cold water. When we have aquatic invasive species introduced to these lakes that are formerly cold water refugia, so a lot of folks know our water is dark here in the Adirondacks, not just because it's necessarily deep water that's dark and light can't get to it because it's physically further from the sun, but also because we have so much zooplankton in our water, and we have a lot of tannins in our water from hemlocks and leaves. And so our water is really dark naturally. So a lot of invasive species we call that are bivalves, you're going to learn about, are filter feeders. So they literally clean phytoplankton out of the water. They clean zooplankton out of the water and plant parts out of the water, which we might think is a great thing, right? We talk about oysters cleaning water and being a really great part of resilient infrastructure for climate change and improving environmental quality in saltwater systems. But in these freshwater systems, when we have these filter feeders cleaning out all of the things I just mentioned that are in the water column, our water gets clearer. Water clarity dramatically increases, and that allows for deeper sunlight penetration into our lakes. So we have those bivalves are changing that light penetration into the water, which changes temperature, which changes what those cold water fish, those brook trout, those lake trout, those salmon need to survive. And then it also allows aquatic invasive plants to further move into deeper parts of lakes where they wouldn't necessarily have been able to get to before. And that'll also start to change a lot of how an ecosystem works. So I just wanted to put that in there, that this is aquatic invasive species can also be directly related to a change in climate in our specific region. And this is, it's really important. So thank you for my part. I'm going to go to the next slide, and I believe it's Brian's turn. I'm going to go on mute and monitor the chat. And this is fun stuff. So I'm sorry for taking up time, Brian. Go for it.
Great, Emily Bell. Thank you so much. That was a great introduction over the impacts of aquatic invasive species. And so now we're going to go and do a high-level species identification and try to give you the key characteristics. So for APIPP, we have a tiered list system. We prioritize different invasive species to manage, and it is important for us to use this approach so that we can be as effective as possible. So we have 7 plants and 7 animals that we are going to review today. I'm not expecting you to be an expert on each and every one of them after this brief 30-minute overview. We're just going to try to put out some of the key characteristics that you can identify. And really nothing replaces being out in the field and looking at these. So go out in your lakes, practice. You can look around. And if you see these, that's the best way to learn. So we're going to start off with the plants. It's important when talking about aquatic plants, which are also called macrophytes, to think about the plant type. And so we use these different terms for them, and they're really important to understand. So emergent means a plant that is emerging from the water and then growing into the air. A floating plant can be a plant that is rooted down in the substrate, but goes all the way up to the top of the water and has some leaves on it, like a lily pad. Then there can be plants that are like algae or macroalgae that are free floating and are not rooted. And then we also have submergent plants, which are plants that are rooted in the substrate of the water body in the lake or pond, and they'll grow up into the water column, but they most of the time will not be above the surface. Although usually they do put some like flowers or fruiting bodies above there at one point of the year. So those are the different types, and those are really key for helping to identify different plants. So emergent, floating, and submergent. You'll hear that a lot. Another descriptor that we use a lot is leaves, and talking about leaves and leaflets. So these are just some different plant terminologies that talk about the veins, the shapes of the leaves, the arrangement. Is it a simple leaf or is it a compound leaf with individual leaflets? We'll talk about the edges. Are they smooth or are they toothed? And then the real one that we talk a lot about is the arrangement on the stem. So alternate, so the leaves go in an alternating pattern on either side of the stem. Opposite, you'll have generally two leaves directly opposite of each other. And then whorled, we have many species of aquatic invasive plants that have this whorled pattern where at one location or node there will be 3 to 6 leaves coming off of it. So that's a little plant terminology 101. And we are going to go into our first one, Eurasian water milfoil, which is one of the most common aquatic invasive species in our region. This is a submergent plant that grows from the bottom all the way through the water column and then can eventually get up to the top, like how you see here. At the height of the growing season, it is growing incredibly fast, up to 1 centimeter a day. And this one is dispersed primarily by fragmentation. So a little part of it breaks off and gets caught on your boat or on a paddle or something, and you go to another lake and it washes into the mud right there. It can start to grow. Imagine a motorboat with a propeller, going through this and just kind of chopping up those individual plant strands. Each one of those plant strands, that's one of the reasons why it spreads so much. This is a map from APIPP Invasives. The data that you collect will hopefully go right into this. So this is an example of citizen science and partners and professionals collecting data in a very useful way. So here we are displaying, you can see Eurasian water milfoil is one of our most widely dispersed invasive species in the region. The key thing for Eurasian water milfoil and all milfoils is these what we call feather-like leaves. So this is one leaf, and each little strand coming off of it is a leaflet. So the leaves are whorled around the stem, usually in 4 leaves. These leaves have usually more than 11 pairs of leaflets. And the key thing for Eurasian water milfoil is this blunt tip. Some people say it looks like it's been snipped off. So they kind of this square edge. Often will have this red or pink cream colored stems. And then in the flowering portion, late July, August around here, there will be an actual flower that will come up above the surface. And when you take the leaf, a plant sample out of the water, it will, here's a picture of it right here. You can see there's a good picture of the leaf and that kind of blunt tip. You can kind of see around here with a coin. Oh, and that one's stuck behind there, but you can see right up here in the top things, when you take it out of the water, it just kind of like collapses on the stem. So the leaves are very soft and not rigid. Another one is variable water milfoil, or called variable leaf water milfoil. In the same genus, has that same feather-like leaf, but it is very dense. So it grows much denser than Eurasian water milfoil and has what they calls a very bushy look to it and appearance. It also spreads primarily by fragmentation. Here is a distribution of variable water milfoil. You can see it more on the northwestern side of the Adirondack region. So once again, it has that whorled pattern. It's usually in 4 to 6. I generally kind of see them in like 5s frequently, or 5 to 6. So a little bit different from Eurasian water milfoil, which usually has 4. And it also has this more triangular appearance of the leaf. It doesn't have that blunt blunt snipped edge. And you can see very, very dense growth, often with a very red or dark brown stem. And then there's the flower. Another aquatic invasive is Fanwort. Sometimes it's called Cabomba, which is the genus. This is a perennial that is a submergent, grows in waters from 4 to 18 feet. This is one that was most likely discarded from an aquarium, so please don't dump aquarium plants or pets out. And it also spreads by fragmentation, and it has this very also kind of bushy appearance to it. We don't see a lot of fanwort. It has not been reported a lot in the IMAP system. There are a few places where it is in our region, but it is one that we are on the lookout for. So these leaves are opposite. So as you can see down here, there are 2 on either side of the stem, and the leaves have a stalk or a petiole that's coming out. So whereas the milfoils are the leaf is directly attached to the stem, this one has this this stalk or petiole that takes it apart and gets a very fan-like. It also is a little bit more rigid, so it kind of will hold up better when it's out of water. And here you can see, if you cut a segment of it, it has this very clear pattern of 2 opposite leaves. So these are what are often called our feathered or compound leaves, but it's important to remember that there are other native plants that can look a little bit similar to them. So not everything you see that has a feathered or branched pattern is a invasive in our lakes. One that's pretty common is called coontail. This has a whorled appearance that you can see around. It has these forked leaves that are much more rigid and hold their shape out of water, but they only do this, there's just one branch to it. So it just comes up and it just forks. So that would be an example of coontail. Another one is bladderwort, really cool plant that is a carnivorous plant that eats zooplankton, and it has these bladders, these little sacs that you can see growing along there. None of our invasive had these bladder structures, so that's a key identifying feature. So here you go, some pictures of bladderwort and coontail. These are native species. And just to make it to make it a little bit harder to keep track of, we also have native milfoils. So on the right, this is what's called world milfoil, and this is northern. On the left is the northern water milfoil. We have about 6 species of native milfoils in the region. So it's important that when you're looking at milfoils to kind of pay a little bit extra attention. This northern one has pairs of leaves, usually in 5 to 10 pairs of leaflets. So the Eurasian water milfoil is usually above 11 or 12. So having fewer leaflets, it also looks like lighter or thinner because of that. Has this more arrow-like shape or leaf-like shape instead of having that square tip. And it usually is a little bit stiffer and holds its shape better out of water. The world milfoil has 8 to 17 pairs of leaflets, a very dark brown or dark green, and the whorls are very, very close together. So that's one of the key features for it. So milfoils, important to pay close attention because we do have native milfoils. Oh, there it is, world milfoil and northern milfoil in our Myriophyllum genus. One that's very easy to identify is water chestnut. This is primarily found in slow-moving waters, and it is a a floating plant that grows on the surface and makes these dense canopies that can really shade out native species. It is an annual that grows from a seed. We see it extensively in Lake Champlain. They've been doing lots of control projects for many years, and down in the south, but this is one we definitely don't want to invade more into our region. It has these really unique nuts, the chestnut that has these spines coming off of it. And the other unique factor about it is that it has two types of leaves. On the surface, it has this very triangular, serrated tooth leaf, and then the submerged leaves kind of look like roots underneath them. And the stems will have an air bladder in them. So here's a picture. Once you see them, it's very easy to identify them and in the field. So this is water chestnut. Another floating plant, but is much, much smaller, is European frogbit. This is one that escaped from cultivation in Canada and has been moving into our area. It disperses by its fruit and fragmentation, and turion, which is an overwintering bud on several of these plants, have that type of feature. So it's this really small little floating plant that you see growing right here. We do have it a little bit spread throughout our prism, throughout the Adirondack region. And you can see that, here it's coming from the Great Lakes and Canada, so you see more prevalent towards the west of us. It has these heart-shaped leaves with white flowers that grow, floats on the surface, and it grows in these dense tangle of stems that are frequently not rooted to the bottom. So if you pull it up, you'll see a lot of different, stems and little root structures, but they don't go all the way down into the substrate. It's also important to remember that we have some native lookalikes that float on the surface. So these are lilies, like our whitewater lily, which has this kind of slit in it. Some people describe it as like a pizza cut mark out of it. The yellow pond lily, which has these lobes with a notch in it and has a yellow leaf. Water shield, which is a really cool plant that floats on the surface. The stem is connected directly to the middle of the leaf is the key characteristic for that, and it has a super slimy feel. If you feel the bottom of it, it has a really unique, slippery, slimy feel to it. And then floating pond lily. So not everything that floats on the surface is an invasive. So once again, it's important to take a close look. There's also things like, like duckweed and sometimes algae that you'll see on the surface too. Curly leaf pondweed is another one of our invasive plants. This is a Potamogeton, which is a pondweed. We have lots of native pondweeds. This one is very interesting because it grows very early in the season. So it actually can grow underneath the ice in the wintertime in our lakes. So it's actually peaks in like June, and by right now, or like by mid-July, depending on where your lake is in elevation or sunlight, it's already dying back. So if you're not out there now looking for curly leaf pondweed, you're probably not going to see it. It has these overwintering buds or turions that will settle in the substrate, and it will overwinter, and then starting in December, it will start to grow up as a submergent plant from the lake bottom, be underneath the ice, and then as soon as ice off comes, it just really explodes and takes off early. Here's some of the distribution of curly leaf pondweed throughout our region.
Curly leaf pondweed.
The key thing for curly leaf pondweed to identify it is it has these, what they call lasagna-like, or some people will say bacon-like. It has these very curvy edges to it that you can see like right up here. And those edges, if you can look at them very closely, are toothed. They're very finely toothed. So these are the key characteristics to tell it apart from other pondweeds, because there are many different types of pondweeds. So here's a couple of examples. You can see clasping leaf pondweed. It has that same wavy kind of shape, but it's when you take it out of water, it's not as rigid. It's not as pronounced. It also has a what you would call an entire or smooth leaf edge or margin. And then the white stem pondweed, very similar type 2, a smooth edge, a little bit of wave, but not as wavy or lasagna-like as the curly leaf pondweed. And last is Hydrilla. This is one that we are very concerned about. It has explosive growth. It is a tropical plant that we thought would not be able to come this far north, but as you can see from this next map, it is moving into our region. And this map doesn't show, but it's all along the Connecticut River in Connecticut. We get, unfortunately, a couple of reports every year from our boat stewards that it is present on boats that are transported into our region. So we really want to keep an eye out for Hydrilla. Hydrilla is this one on the top. It looks very similar to a native one that's called Elodea, but there are some key differences. One, the Hydrilla is in whorls of 4 to 6, usually 5 or 6 leaves in it. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this one. And once again, the leaf margin, the edges of the leaves are finely toothed. So if you look at them closely, they're toothed. And there is a spine going on the midrib. And they often have these tubers, which that they will produce to go into the substrate. And that's how they're able to overwinter and spread. The Elodea is a very common plant in our water bodies. It has leaves in whorls of 3, and the leaf margin is entire. It is smooth. So this is one that we don't have it in our region yet, but we want to make sure it doesn't come in. And if we do see it, we want to find it as soon as possible. So please keep an eye out for Hydrilla. Okay, so next we're going to go to animals. The animals we'll go through pretty quickly, but they are super important because, as Emily Bell was talking about, they can have lots of impacts on our food webs. So the first one is spiny waterflea, and as you can see from this photo of somebody's fingernail, they are tiny. They are, the size of your pinky fingernail. A couple millimeters across. You will not really be able to see these visually in the water. These are something that you can really only see if you do like a plankton tow, or if you are like fishing or have like lines out in the water. Sometimes those spines on this long tail right here get caught up, and they'll kind of gum up like cotton candy or like a jellyfish, people say. So these are ones that are really important to be aware of if you're fishing, but you probably won't just see them like visually if you're just paddling or boating around. We do have some of them in our southern parts and in Lake Champlain in the region. Once again, this is ones, if you look at these pictures, this 2 bags is kind of a good example of showing you they are voracious predators, even though they're so small, and they will eat all the little zooplankton, algae things in there, and they can really change the water clarity and food web. And then the small fish don't want to eat them because they have these spiny tails. So they definitely can alter the food webs. Fishhook waterfleea, very similar type of organism, has this same very long tail with this kind of hook on the end of it, and the hook part with its legs, right there. So once again, very tiny. You're not going to see these visually with your eyes. They will gum up on there. We don't have many reports of them in our IMAP system, so they are a underreported one. We do know that they are out there in a few lakes, so we definitely want to be mindful and keep an eye out for them. Zebra mussels, if you've heard about invasive species, you've probably heard about the zebra mussels. They're kind of like the poster child of them. They are this small, about 1 inch in size bivalve that comes in and can just completely coat and grow over all substrate everywhere. They have this clear striped zebra-like pattern. They're from Eurasia. I think they were initially brought in by bilge water in large shipping containers. And once again, these are the things that, they've drastically changed the water clarity in some of our regional lakes, greatly impact industry. They can clog pipes, they can foul your boating gear. They're sharp. They don't want to step on some of these. So they are definitely something to watch out for. And down in the Hudson River, extensively in the Great Lakes. A very similar related one is a quagga mussel. It grows a little bit bigger, up to 2 inches long. It doesn't have such a striped pattern as the zebra mussel. And the zebra mussel is described as kind of like having this D shape. And if you can actually set it up on one side and it'll sit on like a flat surface. So you see this kind of triangular with a flat bottom. The quagga mussel is more rounded, so it won't sit evenly on a flat surface. We don't see a lot of quagga mussel yet in our region, and so this is something that we're trying to keep an eye out as part of our early detection. And another bivalve is these Asian clams. The Asian clam up here is a non-native one, generally found in like the sediment. We do have native clams and native mussels, so it is important to pay attention and see them. Our native mussels are generally much larger. There are some fingernail clams that are native clams, but they're generally a little bit smaller than the Asian clam. The Asian clams you usually see in sediment, so popular around beaches or docks or areas where there's been vegetation has been removed. We have them in Lake George area, and so it's important that we're really trying to contain them in this area. We don't want them to spread. And once again, these are filter feeders that can come in, just change the water food web and drastically outcompete native mussels. They can grow in incredible densities. A different one is a gastropod, is a Chinese mystery snail. These are very large, very globular snail shells. Sometimes when they're, you can see them, they have like a little banding pattern on them. The key is they have this really large, what's called an operculum or a trap door on it that they use when they come out of water, kind of seals it shut and helps protect the soft body of the snail. We see this one spread around. Oftentimes you kind of see it, floating on the water, or you can see like shells of like deceased ones kind of blown into leeward, windward shores. So keep an eye out on this very large snail. And once again, these can grow in tremendous abundance. Many of them, they outcompete our native snails. They will go through and they're like little lawnmowers. They eat all sorts of plants, scrape off algae. Once again, big affect the food web, and they also snails transmit many parasites. And these parasites can potentially affect fish. In other parts of the world, some places the parasites that these snails harbor affect people. And the last one is rusty crayfish. This is one that's not in our region yet, but we want to keep an eye out because they are voracious little lobsters that go through and will, as you can see from these pictures, they will just eat everything, all plants, aquatic macroinvertebrates, insects, small fish, anything they can get their hands on. The rusty crayfish refers to this dark rust-colored spot on its shell, and they have these black tips or bands on their claws. So be on the lookout for them. We have some in the Lake George southern region, and they're also starting to appear more from the west along our Great Lakes. Definitely do not move them for bait. This is one of the main ways that they get transported is fisher folk, fishermen, fisherwomen, moving them to use for bait. So please do not move crayfish for bait purposes. Okay, so that was kind of a quick overview. If we have any like questions, I see some discussion going on in the chat, which is great. That was a pretty quick overview of our aquatic plants and animals.
There's one question in the chat, Brian, I believe, regarding rusty crayfish in terms of size. So what size are they?
Well, they can vary. You can see them as big as maybe up to like 3-4 inches in size. Like it's when you see a big one, like it's like pretty impressive how a size. So the big ones can be maybe up to 4 or 5 inches max. But most of them are probably around like an inch or 2. I see one question in here is like, do water chestnuts filter water like other filter feeders do? So the water chestnut is a plant. It is taking out nutrients and things from the water, but it's not like a lot of the time when we're talking about filtering the water, we're talking about like the bivalves, so like zebra mussels or quagga mussels, which actively, as part of how they feed, they take in water and they capture all the zooplankton or algae, and then they push out the excess water. So that's an example of filter feeders. So water chestnuts as a plant, they don't use that same mechanism. They do remove some nutrients and things from water, like all plants do.
I would say they can also remove water from the aquatic system through transpiration. So that's another thing that plants do. So thanks, Brian. Another question is, are there any good field guides that specifically cover Adirondack aquatic invasive species?
I wouldn't say there are ones specifically for the Adirondacks, but there are definitely regional ones for New York, the Northeast, that we will talk about. I have a couple, ones right here. Like here's one. This one's actually at the Upper Midwest that is pretty popular. There's this other one from Maine that I find really, really useful, a Maine one. But we have links to those in our materials and online, so we will send that out to everybody. And they are great to bring out with you when you are in the field and looking at it, because there's no better way to learn than looking at these plants and animals outside in nature.
Another, I got a few questions here. APIPP previously had shared the Adirondack Aquatic Plant Guide, which is a key by Sean Regaldo. I'm sorry if I said that incorrectly. I do not believe that we will be sharing those out, but what we will be giving to folks will be I wish I was able to use my computer camera, but a laminated small key ring of quick facts on the back and images on the front for helping you identify invasive plants and animals that we talked about here today while you're out in the field. And they're super small, so you'll be able to clip it, say, to your personal flotation device and just take it out when you need. We'll also be putting these slides online, and I'll be emailing out those links to everybody in follow-up emails to this workshop. Kind of similar to the giant, homework email they sent out yesterday. So we'll try to get you as many resources as possible. And I believe that DEC is reprinting their Lake Champlain Aquatic Invasive Species Guide. It's a large government agency, so it takes a long time to get those approved. And that'll have the majority of our species and then more. I don't think it'll leave any of the species out.
One thing to add, Emily Bell, so you're going to get, everyone will be able to access, and you'll get a follow-up email, as Emily Bell said, with lots of these materials. So the main resource that you'll get is what we call our Lakes Protectors Manual. And in that has lots of fact sheets about the plants. It does have the Adirondack Aquatic Invasive Plant ID key in it. So that's one of the chapters in it. And also, like Emily Bell said, we created this kind of little quick key guides, and you'll get a laminated version of that. So all that information is in the manual.
Cool. So maybe next we'll just quickly go through, best management practices for preventing the spread and introduction of aquatic invasive species. I'll go through it really quick. If you go to the next slide, Brian. Next one. So it's no surprise to anybody here that people and human activity are the primary vector of spread and introduction of aquatic invasive species, not just the Adirondack Park, but across the globe. But we want to make sure that, we're all recreating responsibly, that we're making this, a welcoming, wonderful place for everybody to enjoy by boat, in their waders, by fishing. And so really the best way to prevent the spread of harmful aquatic invasive species is simple. We just have to get the word out and get folks participating. So next slide, please. And this has been easier to talk about with COVID because people understand quarantining and, best prevention practices now. So, let's go, I could go on and on about cleaning your boats and cleaning your gear and cleaning your waders, but cleaning and removing plants and visible plants, mud, and animals from all of your gear before you leave a lake while you're on land in the boat wash station or before you head out up into the Adirondacks is vital. And so what's really important with this cleaning is that invertebrates are hard to see. So all of those, zebra mussel larvae, quagga mussel larvae, spiny fishhook waterflea, even adults, let alone larvae, are nearly invisible. And that's also how they travel around. So you might think your boat is clean, but if you've been in a water body with invasive invertebrates and animals, you might not even know what you're carrying. So it's really important to think about hot water, where it is, and where you can use it. So if you go to the next slide, please. So hot water and a physical removal with either a brush or a power wash is incredibly important to kill aquatic invasive invertebrates and animals. And so, the first principle, we just had a leave no trace workshop when boating in the Adirondacks. And the first principle of leave no trace is know before you go. So know where your boat and wader wash stations are across the Adirondacks or across New York State. And I know you're all amazing stewards of the Adirondacks, but you are always welcome to let your friends know that these resources exist too. So on adkcleanboats.org, the Adirondack Watershed Institute has a really extensive map of all the free decontamination stations across the Adirondacks. And on our website, and I'll send this out too, on our resources tab, we have locations for these free boat wash stations across the state. So that's also really important, as we see a lot of folks are traveling from all over to our area. So let folks know that these stations are there to use 140-degree hot water, high pressure stations to decontaminate your boat. Next, please. We also got a couple questions about salt solutions, and I'll get to that in a second. So draining your boat, removing all water and all holding compartments before you leave an access site, so that any invertebrates or larvae that you do not see with your naked eye are not also in that water that you're carrying with you to another space. And bait buckets are also a really big part of this as well. So drain those on land or in the trash. It's hard to throw a lot of water in a trash bag. So drain it on land. The water, I'll get to in a second too. So next slide. Dry. So people ask us a lot of questions in terms of drying your boat. How many days do I dry it for? How many hours do I dry it for? It depends on relative humidity, air temperature, and what type of equipment you're using. So like a day like today where it's incredibly swampy outside, even if something is in the sun, it's going to take a long time to dry. And so that's where we get back to those hot water, high pressure boat wash stations as well. Using hot water and high pressure boat wash stations can reduce the amount of dry time you have to use. So if you're not using hot water and high pressure boat wash station, a minimum of 5 to 7 days of drying time in a dry, sunny area is highly recommended. But if you use those Adirondack Watershed Institute boat wash stations across the Adirondack Park, you can really limit that dry time because you're killing anything on your gear with hot water. Next, please. And I'm sorry, I know we're at 10 a.m. I'm gonna go fast. So disinfect, we got a couple questions about this. That hot water is incredibly effective as a disinfection agent. It's important to disinfect any of your gear if you do not have time for materials to dry before reuse. So you just surveyed a lake, you're only up here for 2 weeks, you wanna go survey another lake, hit up that hot water, high pressure free boat wash station. You can soak equipment in hot water that is 140 degrees for just 30 seconds. So your waders, your fishing gear, your PDF, anything that came into contact with water. If you're on the west branch of the Ausable River, you're going to find a lot of these free wader wash stations that have a salt solution in them. So using the brushes and the salt water solution can also kill invertebrates that might be traveling on your boots, or didymo or invasive plants. So if it's visible, you can remove it. Bleach solutions, I can give you information about making a bleach solution, and using 409 is not necessary in our area. That's about fish diseases that are primarily on the west coast of the United States, and we don't want to leave that soap residue in our water. So salt solution, use those hot water boat wash stations, know before you go and know where the nearest one is to you. Next, please. Proper bait disposal. This is how we have rusty crayfish in the first place. So even worms, any crayfish, any small fish, do not release live bait from your bait bucket into any waterway or even on land, because a lot of invasive worms are also, I could go on, they're also being sold as bait. So please, it hurts to like put little worms in the garbage, but please do not release live bait into water or on land. Drain your bait buckets, as I mentioned, and always encourage others to follow these guidelines. Next, please. And don't release live pets, please. Just don't do it. Don't release live pets. My job in college was to save red-eared slider turtles out of the East River when people would sort of throw them in there like frisbees. Turtles live forever, so just don't buy turtles. You can try to contact local shelters to rehome unwanted pets, but it's likely not going to happen. So just plan long-term before buying or adopting domestic pets. Aquaria and aquarium owners and enthusiasts have, unfortunately, like with terrestrial plants and gardeners and horticultural history, have unfortunately been really connected to the introduction of aquatic invasive species across North America. If you guys follow our social media, you'll remember back in the winter, these moss balls for aquarium that were sold to big box pet stores across North America were actually infested with zebra mussels. And so, just think twice before becoming an aquarium enthusiast or turtle owner. And I say that as a lover of both. Next, please. Waders, just quickly, try to always make sure you're using and buying rubber-soled waders and not felt-soled waders. And if you're using felt-soled waders, because these can hold a lot of aquatic invasive species and bring it to new water bodies, try to just use those felt-soled shoes in one water body and keep them clean regularly so they're not spreading materials from one place to another. Next, please. All right. So those are all my best management practices in 6 minutes. I think we have a few more questions, Brian, that I wasn't able to look at on the chat.
Yes, lots of great questions in the chat. I tried to answer a few. One was somebody asked about drawing down lakes, so drawing the water level down as a management tool. This is something that can happen if you have like a dam or a reservoir. It is a very blunt tool to use because you are affecting lots of native plants and species and animals. And also remember that the seeds or turions or buds, oftentimes they can lie in the substrate for long periods of time. And then when the water level comes back up, they'll just be able to regrow. So a tool that should be used infrequently and with good study and thoughts about what the unintended consequences might be.
There was another question about the, limits on where boat wash stations are across the Adirondacks due to the challenges or limitations of having electric power at the majority of access points across the Adirondacks. I would say that's definitely true, but these stations are still pretty widespread and near population centers. So it does depend on where your camp is. It does depend on where you live. That's absolutely true. But if you're traveling back home from where you're boating for that day, if you happen to know the location before you go of the nearest boat station, and you want to keep boating lake to lake throughout your, without a lot of dry time between usage, that decontamination is really vital. So though it might be out of the way, if we know there's aquatic invasive species in one lake and we want to travel to another the next day, might be out of the way, but it's just such an important thing to do. Oh, some stations have portable electric generators. I think we might have a few people on the call who actually have worked for the Adirondack Watershed Institute boat wash station. So if Zach is able to, if he is still here, he could pipe up for sure. We're also going to send volunteers clean drain dry towels so that you can dry your boat with your towels as well. I'd imagine that, yeah. Oh, okay, so I'm seeing that wash stations are typically powered by gasoline engines. So that's always fun. It's the lesser of two evils, right? Super. So I know that there's a lot more questions. Brian, I am gonna let you field the remainder of questions. I'm gonna stop this recording, and before the next section of this workshop, I'm gonna try to go figure out some technical problems on my end. So I'm gonna stop this recording